What's going on guys, Jin here. This is an intro level Blizzard build for newer or more casual players, or those looking to have a fun icy time in the endgame without going on a crazy gear grind. There will be more advanced mythic options in the build planner, but I'll be focusing on the base build here. It clears gauntlets reasonably fast, and can take up to at least tier 7 on the boards and down all the uber bosses, as well as doing reasonably well in the pits, clearing tier 100 in about 2.5 minutes on average. If you enjoy these kinds of guides, consider liking, subscribing, hitting the bell and leaving a comment down below. It really helps out a lot and it's much appreciated. Now let's get into the build. So for the skill tree, we're going to take 2 into Firebolt, then come down to our core skills, go for 1 in Frozen Orb, and then take the Greater Frozen Orb. Then we'll take 1 into Devastation. In our defensive skills, we're going to take 1 into Flame Shield, 1 into Teleport, and go for the Shimmering Teleport. Then we're going to go for 3 into Glass Cannon, 1 into Elemental Attunement, 1 into Ice Armor, and go for the Mystical Ice Armor. In our Conjuration skills, we're going to take 1 into Ice Blades, going for the Summoned Ice Blades. Then we're going to take 1 into Lightning Spear, and go for the Invoked Lightning Spear. We're also going to take 3 into Conjuration Mastery, 3 into Protection, and 3 into Mana Shield. And then we're going to take 2 into Align the Elements. In our Mastery skills, we're going to take 1 into Blizzard, and go for the Mage's Blizzard. And then we're going to take 1 into Inner Flames, and 3 in Devouring Blaze. Then in our ultimate skills, we're going to take 3 into Permafrost, Hoarfrost, Frigid Breeze, and Icy Touch. Then we're also going to get 1 into Coursing Currents, and 3 into Electrocution. And for the key passive, we're going to take Veer's Mastery. For the enchantments, we're going to take Frozen Orb as our first enchantment. Whenever we cast a non-basic skill, we have a 30% chance to launch a Frozen Orb at a nearby enemy, and Frozen Orb's explosion has a 40% chance to make all enemies hit vulnerable for 3 seconds. Frozen enemies are always made vulnerable. For our second enchantment, we're going to take the Firebolt enchantment, so direct damage from skills applies additional burning damage over 8 seconds. This is how we'll proc our Devouring Blaze, and also our Flame Feeder Glyph. Next up, we have the Paragon Board. In the starting board, we're going to take the Winter Glyph, so whenever we chill or freeze an enemy, we deal 4% increased cold damage for 10 seconds up to 18%. Our second board is going to be the Enchantment Master board, and we're going to be putting in the Elementalist Glyph here, so dealing fire, cold or lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage we deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. For our third board here, we're going to go for the Frigid Fate board, taking the Legendary Node, so we'll deal extra damage to vulnerable enemies equal to 20% of the total amount of our bonus damage with cold, up to a maximum of 60%, which we should have. For the glyph, we're going to be using Stalagmite here, so that gives us increased Ice Spike damage, and our Ice Spikes gain 20% critical strike chance. For our fourth board, we're going to be going for the Burning Instinct board. And for the glyph, we're going to be using Tactician, so we deal 10% increased damage for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill, and the duration is increased by 4 seconds for each defensive skill not on our action bar. For our fifth board, coming up here, we're going to be taking the Icefall board, so our frost skills deal 25% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. This bonus is doubled if the enemy is also frozen, so make sure we take that Legendary Node. And then for our glyph, we're going to be using the Flame Feeder Glyph for that extra damage to burning enemies, and we also deal 10% increased direct damage to burning enemies. For our sixth board, we're going to be going for the Ceaseless Conduit board, and we're putting in the Destruction Glyph here for that critical strike damage. Also, critical strikes increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds, up to 12%. Last but not least, our seventh board, we're going to take the Searing Heat board, and we're going to go for the Exploit Glyph here for that vulnerable damage, and dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases our damage by 1% for 6 seconds, up to 10%. If I went too quick for you, don't forget to check out the build planner in the description below. That's going to have the Paragon Board, enchantments, gear, and everything else, as well as variations on the build. Next up we have the gear. So for the gear, I'm going to list the affixes you want on the left as well as the tempering, and let's start with the helm. So we're going to go for a Godslayer crown as our helm. That's going to give us all stats, max life, damage to elites, and cooldown reduction. More importantly, when we stun, freeze, or immobilize an enemy, we pull in all nearby enemies and deal 30 to 60% increased damage to them for 3 seconds, occurring once every 12 seconds. And against bosses, this effect triggers when dealing damage instead. So this is a huge multiplier of damage here. Definitely want to get your hands on a Godslayer crown. For the masterworking, we're going to masterwork that cooldown reduction. If you don't have a Godslayer crown, you would use a normal helm with cooldown reduction, intelligence, and mana per second. You would temper that with warmth and lucky hit percent chance to immobilize. As for the masterworking, you would also masterwork the cooldown reduction. And for the aspect, you would use ever living, so you take 10 to 25% less damage from crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. Next up we have the chest piece. We're going to be using a normal chest piece with intelligence, armor, and mana per second. And we're going to temper that with warmth and lucky hit percent chance to stun. As for the masterworking, we're going to masterwork the intelligence. And for the aspect, we'll be using snow guards, so while within our blizzard, and for 3 seconds after leaving it, we take 15 to 30% less damage. For the gloves, we're going to be getting some gloves with crit chance, attack speed, and intelligence. And we're going to temper that with ice spike damage and lucky hit percent chance to freeze. We're going to try and masterwork that attack speed, and we're going to put on the aspect of the frozen tundra. So our ice spikes have a 50% increased explosion radius. The other part of the aspect is not very relevant to the build. For the pants, we're going to be using Tybalt's Will here. That's going to give us all stats, max life, max resource, and damage reduction whilst unstoppable. Also, we deal 10 to 20% increased damage while unstoppable and for 5 seconds after, and gain 50 primary resource when we become unstoppable. So really good pants here, great damage multiplier, and some good damage reduction. For the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork that damage reduction whilst unstoppable. If you don't have access to Tybalt's Will, you would use some normal pants with intelligence, max life, and armor. Temper that with warmth and crowd control duration. Aspect wise, you're going to be using Mage Lords there, so the Veer's Mastery Key passive also grants you 6 to 9% damage reduction, tripled while fighting a close enemy. And for the masterworking, you would masterwork the intelligence. Next up we have the boots. We're going to be using normal boots with intelligence, mana per second, and movement speed if possible. You would temper that with evade cooldown reduction and crowd control duration. As for the masterworking, you would want to masterwork the intelligence. And for the aspect, we're going to be using the aspect of metamorphosis. So when we evade, we turn into a cloud of bats, becoming unstoppable for 2.5 seconds, and enemies along the path take physical damage and are inflicted with vampiric curse. And evade's cooldown is also increased by between 5 to 10 seconds. So this pairs really well with Tybalt's Will, as it's going to give us unstoppable every time we evade, and you want to try and get boots with the built-in implicit of attacks reduce evade's cooldown. That's going to let you evade and keep that unstoppable up pretty much constantly, which gives you that huge damage reduction thanks to Tybalt's Will. Next up for the weapon, we're using a two-handed weapon here. We're going to go for intelligence, crit damage, and max life. We're going to temper that with ice spike damage and lucky hit percent chance to deal shadow or poison damage, as that's going to be the fourth element in order to stack our tower ashes. As for the masterworking, you would want to try and masterwork the ice spike damage. For the aspect, we're going to be using the glacial aspect. So when we cast Blizzard, it will periodically spawn exploding ice spikes that deal damage, and the ice spikes chill enemies for 30%. This is our main source of damage with this build, so we're putting it on the two-handed weapon to get the 200% effectiveness. This build doesn't really work without this aspect, so make sure before you swap to it you have at least a good glacial aspect. Now, if you do want to use one-handed weapons, you would use a one-handed weapon with the exact same stats as the two-hander, so you want to get intelligence, crit damage and max life, as well as ice spike damage and lucky hit percent chance to deal shadow or poison damage. And for the aspect, you would use Storm Swell, so you deal 15 to 30% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while you have a barrier. And if possible, you would want to get a wand. For your offhand, you would want something with intelligence, crit chance, and cooldown reduction, and you would temper that with ice spike damage and chance for ice blades to cast twice. As for the aspect, we would use the aspect of shredding blades, so ice blades chance to apply vulnerables increased by 20%, and the vulnerable durations increased by 4 seconds. You also gain 15 to 30% vulnerable damage. As for the masterworking, you would masterwork the ice spike damage just like the one-handed weapon, or the critical strike chance. Next up we have the Amulet. We're going to use an Amulet with Devouring Blaze, attack speed and crit chance if possible. Cooldown reduction, Glass Cannon and Conjuration Mastery are all okay affixes as well. And you would want to temper that with Ice Blade's cooldown reduction and Ice Spike damage. As for the masterworking, definitely masterworking the Devouring Blaze here. As for the aspect, we're going to be using the Storm Swell aspect here, so we deal 23 to 45% increased damage to vulnerable enemies whilst we have a barrier. If you are using the one-hand weapon and the focus, then you would put the Glacial aspect on the Amulet instead. Next up, the rings. We've got the Blue Rose as our first ring. That gives us critical strike chance, cold damage, ice spike damage, and chance for ice spikes to explode twice. Also on lucky hit, up to a 30% chance to form an exploding ice spike, dealing cold damage, and triple this chance if the enemy is frozen. For the masterworking here, we're going to try and masterwork the ice spike's chance to explode twice. For our second ring, we're going to be using Talrash's Iridescent Loop. That gives us lucky hit chance, non-physical damage, cooldown reduction, and ranks into potent warding. And for each type of elemental damage we deal, gain 10 to 20% increased damage for 4 seconds, up to 40 to 80%, and dealing elemental damage refreshes all bonuses. And for this build we're going to be getting 4 types of elemental damage, so we can potentially get up to 80% increased damage here. If you don't have access to these 2 rings, you would want to use a ring with critical strike chance, attack speed, and intelligence. And you would want to temper that with Ice Blade's cooldown reduction and Ice Spike damage. As for the masterworking, you would masterwork the attack speed. For the aspects, you would want to use the conceded aspect, so you deal 10 to 25% increased damage while you have a barrier active, and the aspect of shredding blades if you don't use that on your focus. If you're running into mana problems, then you would use something like Umbral. That will restore 1 to 6 of your primary resource when you crowd control an enemy. You shouldn't run out of mana anyway with this build, but with Umbral you really won't run out of mana. Next up, the gems. We're going to be using the skulls and the jewellery for the armor. We're going to be using the emeralds in the weapons for the critical strike damage. And we're going to either be using rubies for max life, or topazes for intelligence in the armor. And that pretty much wraps up the build. So if you enjoyed the video or made it this far, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell as it really helps out the channel a lot and I really appreciate it. So thanks a lot for watching, and I'll leave you with some blizzarding action. Hope to see you in the next video. Bye!